At first, I would like to thank the organizers of this wonderful conference, Dr. Angela Bellia and her co-organizer, Alfonsina Pagano, for the invitation. It is a great honor for me to participate in this very inspiring webinar. I recently finished a book about the earliest music in ancient Egypt. During that, I came across a very important scene from the tomb of Debeheni that allows significantly new insights into the importance of dance in Egyptian culture. The scene reveals a whole new emphasis between musical instruments, singing and dancing, as we will see in the following. Dance and cult have been closely connected in ancient Egypt since earliest times. Several depictions appear in temples and tombs, showing the performance of dance in the context of rituals and apparently for entertainment. While dance activities are attested from time to time in these sacred spaces, those in private context are seldom documented, although it can be strongly assumed that they took place since dance and music are human universals. That such evidence does not exist does not imply that there was no dancing in private context, but only that it is not documented. Therefore, it is a question of the source situation at which places, which scenes were depicted or not. This lecture will focus on the following questions. Where and in which context do the earliest depictions appear? Who were the dancers? Which movements are attested? Is there a change in the course of time? To answer these questions, we will, after a short introduction, see how dance is depicted. Then I give you a short overview about dance in ancient Egypt. We look at the costumes and the instruments played by the dancers and at the context before we draw the conclusion. Dance in ancient Egypt presents itself as extraordinarily diverse, ranging from static to ecstatic to acrobatic. While musicians are often instructed by chironomists, this is not documented for dancers. Who were the dancers? As general performers, men and women are attested. Those dancers who appear in an official context, be it in a procession or in a funeral, are certainly professionals. While members of the royal family like Nefertiti and her daughters, as well as the king, can be shown with a sistrum as a kind of musician, this is not attested in connection with dance. How is dance depicted? Dancers can be recognized by the fact that, for example, they have both their arms raised above their heads, which has been a typical gesture since the earliest times, or by other poses whereby the position of one arm does not necessarily correspond to that of the other. Moreover, their feet are raised more or less above the ground. Sometimes this is barely perceptible, as in the tomb of Khenamun, so you have to look very closely to see that she is moving. Most of the depictions show identical postures among the dancers, as we will see here, which would suggest uniform movements as in today's ballet. However, this is not always the case. As the relief in the tomb of Kai-Khenet shows, we see some of the dancers have different postures to the others. Dancers are usually depicted in groups. Sometimes same-sex couples dancing with each other are documented, as we see here in a scene in Der el-Gebrawi. From time to time, the name of dances are preserved. We see here, we can read it together. This is the Iba dance. It is written between the dancers. Another dance that is attested is a so-called mirror dance. During the mirror dance, the artists have a mirror in one hand and a clapper in the other. They seem to present the objects to each other during the performance. Perhaps they also make a sound by beating their clapper against that of their respective dance partner. Now a short overview about dance in ancient Egypt. The first evidence for dance appears in the rock paintings in the Cave of the Beast, 6,500 to 4,400 BC. And then in the paintings of the 4th millennium BC, we have these wonderful Nagada vessels, and they show dancers. You see it once again here in a detail. The vessels are usually documented in tombs, so that a connection between the scenes and death is obvious. Probably the dance was used to attract the attention of the gods so that they will guide the deceased on the way to the afterlife. Equivalents made of clay with raised arms belong to the same period. Among the earliest evidence of dance in a temple, that is this scene. It appears on the so-called Two Dogs palette from the temple of Hierakonpolis. We see a human being in the shape of a jackal playing the flute and animals dancing to the music. Another evidence is depicted on a very important icon, the ceremonial mace head of King Scorpion II, again from the same temple of the Hierakonpolis temple. We see dancing women in association with the king. The performance takes place open air. At this time, not only women but male dancers appear as well. On the fragment of the so-called Bira mace set, again from the temple of Hierakonpolis, dating to 3300 BC, two male dancers with pigtails are shown in a Hebzet scene, the most important festival for the king. Since 2600 BC, numerous depictions on tomb walls show dance and music. The representations are not standardized. Here we see a rather moderate dance, while this one from the same period is more agile. All in all, one can distinguish between moderate dance, ecstatic dance, and, as we see later, acrobatic dance. Occasionally, the representation of the dancer's legs are such that they cannot show actual dance situation due to the statics or gravity and the limits of human movement capabilities. And this is a good example for what we have to keep in mind. These music scenes are not photos, but they are depicted in the tombs in a certain way and for certain reasons. If there was only little space, either fewer dancers could be depicted or less space could be allocated per actor. In the Middle and New Kingdom, the dancers may be depicted in such a way that none of their feet touches the ground. We see here one of the dancers jumping up. Moreover, acrobatic elements are documented, with the earliest evidence being found in Dynasty 6 in the tomb of Khamenei 2300 BC. Their number increases in the Middle and New Kingdom, as shown, for example, in this painting in the tomb of Warkar II, in which the active backward flip, with the feet raised high up in the air, is depicted, conveying the impression of a very lively performance. In a relief in the Karnak temple dating to 1450 BC, this acrobatic dancing style with backbending is depicted, taking place during the Opet festival. Therefore, this dance could be performed during religious processions as well. Primarily, only women are depicted in these acrobatic dance scenes. And probably you know this very famous scene in Ostrakon, now in the Museo Egizio in Turin. The precise reconstruction of dances is difficult because no melodies have survived from the pharaonic period, even though attempts are sometimes made to reproduce sequences or patterns of movements. However, in the tomb of Kheroef, a kind of movement sequence is depicted. We see here the ladies with the head up. In the next sequence, they have the head down. Again, the head up. And in the next scene, down with the hands on the ground. A short look at the clothing. We have splendidly dressed female musicians, but often the dancers as well as the lutists only wear bangles, headdress, belt, and collars. We have the same here in the very famous scene in the tomb of Nepamun and at Jebel el Silsila. Again, only headdress, belt, and collar. Nevertheless, from time to time, there is a special clothing, this apron and sashes crossed over the breast. Very seldom is this, again, our apron, and the hair ending in a disc. A short look about the musical activities of dancers, that is singing, hand clapping, and finger snipping. And the instruments they use are clappers, lute, round and rectangular frame drum, and the old system, but only in the Old Kingdom. Now a look at the context. Egyptian dance scenes appear in temples or tombs. In the latter, they usually appear in front of the tomb owner, as we see it here. They seem to represent entertainment situations, but there is much more in it than that. They appear between the offerings, and they are a kind of eternal offering to the deceased. The scenes are ritually connotated because they are shown in tombs. They serve the perpetuation of the connection and communication between the deceased and the relative still living. Possibly it is to be interpreted as a kind of ancestor celebration. The scenes reflect the interface of the deceased and the living. Assmann sees in them sacrificial cult and biographical demonstration. Furthermore, they are a status indicator because they serve the demonstration of luxury, as for example also in the case of the depiction of the very expensive and luxurious chariots in the tombs. It is obvious that dance and music is significantly important at the interface between life and death. This is even more evident in this example. This is the one that I talked about in the beginning. The scene is depicted in the mastaba of Debeheni that dates to the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. This example is unique and extremely important since it shows the ritual during the funeral, including dance and singing. However, it is noteworthy that no musical instrument appears at this very significant intersection between life and death, but only dancing and singing. Now let us draw the conclusion. The earliest evidence in ancient Egypt appears in rock art, followed in the 4th millennium by depictions on vessels in tombs, and shortly after that in temples. In the case of the rock carvings, the context is difficult to determine. In the tombs and temples, they appear in religious scenes, often showing rituals. Who the dancers are can only be determined if it is included as an accompanying text. Due to the often complex dance steps, it can be assumed that the dancers depicted are professionals. The ecstatic dance is presented about 2600 BC, the acrobatic dance 300 years later. Obviously, a change can be observed here. Regarding the question which movements appear in which context, it should be noted the moderate movements as well as the ecstatic and acrobatic dances appear in tombs and in temples. Dancing already takes place in the earliest representations in dance groups consisting of several persons. Usually no solo dance in the sense that only one dancer appears in a scene is documented. Partner dances consisting of a male and a female, as we know it from the European Middle Ages and the modern era, are not attested. The earliest evidence for dance appears in tombs and temples in sacred rituals and at the significant intersection between life and death, as attested in the tombs, and at the interconnection point between gods and humans, documented in the temples at the Set Fest and so on. Thus, besides singing, it was the most important means of mediation and communication between the spheres. One dances not to express oneself physically, but to achieve something in the other sphere, and to please the gods, be it for one's own interests or for those of other people from the family or the religious community. During the funeral ritual, one wants to make the gods satisfied through the dance and specifically to enable the deceased an easier way into the afterlife. Now referring to my provocative title, you can't dance away death, but you can make the transition to the afterlife easier for the deceased. What is exceptionally important is that apparently dance occupies a higher position in the context of these connections to the other sphere than musical instruments. If we remember the scene in the tomb of Debeheni, singing and dancing is shown, but no musical instruments. Obviously, this is due to the fact that singing and also dancing is performed directly with the own body and not, as in the case of the musical instruments, merely indirectly. So if you have questions that do not come to your mind at once, please feel free to write me an email, even in the middle of the night. I wrote several articles about it. If you are interested, write me. I will send them to you as a PDF. And here we have our famous Debeheni. This is an article that was published just 2 days ago. Thank you very much for your attention.